My name is Dana Whitfield, and I was 32 the night my fiance's family tried to buy my silence for the price of my own name. It happened at our engagement dinner. In a private room at the oldest inn in town, 40 guests watching. When my future mother-in-law slid a folded document across the linen tablecloth and said, loud enough for the back tables to hear, that I should sign it because a woman like me didn't belong marrying into a family like theirs. I read every line. I picked up the pen. They all leaned in, certain they already knew how this ended. They thought the folder sitting in my lap was empty. What I did next with that pen already in my hand, and why my future father-in-law nearly knocked over his own wine glass standing up too fast. That's the part none of them saw coming. Welcome back to Calm Drama Vault, where the quietest person at the table is usually the one holding the whole thing up. If a story about being underestimated by the people who owed you the most has ever kept you up at night, you're among friends here. Drop a comment and subscribe, because to understand that pen, you have to go back to a tow truck, a pair of steel toe boots, and everything I taught myself to hide. I own a company called Whitfield Fleet Services. Commercial towing, roadside assistance, and vehicle recovery contracts across 2 states. 11 years ago, it was one used flatbed and me sleeping in the cab between calls. Now it's 32 trucks, 70 employees, and contracts with 3 trucking companies, 2 hospital systems, and the state highway department. When a semi jackknifes on the interstate at 3 in the morning, my crews are the reason the road opens back up by sunrise. That business made me a wealthy woman, though you'd never guess it looking at me. I drive a beat-up '08 pickup with a cracked windshield I keep meaning to fix. I wear the same canvas work jacket I wore at 23. My hands have calluses because I still ride out on recovery calls when a crew runs short. Money for me has always been something you build quietly and then never mention. I learned that the hard way. Every time someone found out what I actually had, something shifted in their face. The math started. The asking followed. A boyfriend once told me I made him feel small, and then made absolutely sure I felt smaller. So I got good at looking like I had nothing. I let people assume the modest truck and the worn jacket told the whole story. I called it humility. It was really armor. The armor started with my grandfather. He raised me after my mother couldn't. He ran a 2-bay garage his whole life and never once acted like grease under his nails. Made him less than the men in suits who dropped their cars off. He had a pair of steel-toe work boots, resoled twice, that he wore until the day he couldn't stand anymore. When I complained as a kid that we didn't have what other families had, he'd tap those boots on the concrete floor and say, "Worth isn't handed to you, Dana. It's built one bolt at a time. And nobody can unbuild what you already finished." He died when I was 20. He left me almost nothing anyone could deposit in a bank. He left me those boots. I started my company 2 years after his funeral with those boots in the back of my truck. And they've been in that truck for every important day since. They were there the day I signed my first 6-figure contract. They were there the day I paid off the loan on truck number 32. I still keep them close, more than I'd admit to anyone. That's the part the Pierces never could have known, sitting in their inn with their family name etched into the cornerstone. They thought a person's worth came stamped on them at birth. My grandfather taught me it comes off your hands. I met Nathaniel Pierce on the side of a highway at 11 at night in the pouring rain. He taught high school English and was standing over his stalled sedan with a road flare in one hand and absolutely no idea what he was doing, which is how most of my favorite stories start. I hooked up his car in under 10 minutes, and he asked, while we waited for the tow, what I was reading right now instead of asking what I did for a living. When I told him, he lit up and quoted a line from the same book back at me, and we stood there in the rain arguing about the ending until the truck's heater finally kicked in. He was gentle in a way I wasn't used to. His coat had a torn pocket he hadn't bothered fixing. He looked at me like I was interesting, not like I was a number he was trying to solve. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the armor click into place. I gave him my number, which I almost never did, and told myself it was because he taught English and had kind eyes. Really, it was because he'd spent 40 minutes with me in the rain and never once asked what I was worth. 2 years later, I understood why. In his world, They only asked that question about people they'd already decided to reject. I knew the name Pierce before I knew Nathaniel. The whole county did. It was carved into the cornerstone of the old textile mill that had closed decades before I was born, and it hung under the oldest portraits at the County Historical Society. Men in stiff collars who used to own half the mill town before the mill stopped running. The Pierces were what people meant when they said old family. Not visibly rich, exactly, but seated. The kind of name that got you a table without a reservation. Nathaniel carried it like a coat that didn't quite fit. He'd left the family orbit deliberately, taken a teaching job his mother considered beneath the name, and built a small, quiet life entirely his own. Around me, he seemed lighter, like a man who'd finally set something heavy down. "It's why I love you," he told me once. "You have no idea who my family is, and you wouldn't care if you did." I laughed and told him he was right. I didn't care about the portraits or the cornerstone. But I noticed, even then, how carefully he said, "my family." The way you'd name a storm system tracking toward the coast. I asked him once what it had been like, growing up inside that name. He got quiet, then said something I filed away and didn't understand for a long time. "There's nothing more expensive," he said, "than a family that's run out of everything except its name." I thought it was just a nice turn of phrase. I didn't know yet it was a warning. The first dinner was at the family's lake property, a big shingled house that had clearly been grand once and was tired now in ways I noticed and pretended not to. Catherine Pierce met me at the door in a string of pearls and a smile that could cut glass. She held my hand a beat too long, glanced at my plain coat, and asked warmly what I did out there with the trucks. I said I ran a towing and recovery company. "Oh," she said. "How practical." The word landed like an insult dressed as a compliment, and the smile never moved. At dinner, Nathaniel's sister Bianca leaned in with the energy of a woman conducting a survey. "And your family, are they local?" I told her my grandfather had raised me and passed years ago. "Oh," she said, and let the silence finish the sentence for her. They were kind the way a locked door is polished. Every question had a floor under it, and the floor was always the same. Where do you come from, and is it anywhere that matters? I sat there, running a company that kept half the county's highways moving, and said almost nothing about it. I let them believe the cracked windshield truck in the driveway was the whole story. Nathaniel squeezed my hand under the table like he was proud of how well I was taking it. I told myself I was being gracious. Really, I was doing what I'd always done, making myself smaller so nobody would have a reason to send me away. Here's the thing I need you to understand, because otherwise none of what I let happen makes sense. I didn't want the Pierce money. There wasn't any to want, though I didn't know that yet. What I wanted was the table. I grew up with one grandfather and a two-bay garage and no cousins at any holiday. I built a company because I was good at building things out of nothing. But you can't build a family out of nothing. You have to be let in. So when Nathaniel took me back to that same stretch of highway on our anniversary, and got down on one knee in the rain with a plain silver band he'd saved 4 months of a teacher's salary for, I didn't think about his mother. I thought about a place to belong. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Catherine asked to see the ring the way an appraiser asks to see a flaw. She turned my hand toward the window light, studied the modest band, and said, "How sensible," in a tone that made sensible sound like the worst word in the English language. Then she got to work. Within a week she'd appointed herself planner of a wedding I hadn't asked her to plan. It would be at the inn, of course. The Pierces always married at the inn. The guest list would run through her, because there were people whose grandfathers had known Nathaniel's grandfather. When I mentioned inviting my crew, the people who'd built my life beside me, she smiled and said we'd see about space. Everything I wanted was something we'd see about. Everything they wanted was already decided. What followed were the tests, though nobody called them that. At the next dinner, Catherine watched which fork I reached for and corrected me with her eyes before I touched the wrong one. When I mentioned a show I loved, Bianca said, "Oh, that's cute," in the voice you use for a child's drawing. When I spoke, Catherine would wait a beat, then repeat what I'd said in slightly more polished language, translating me for the room. I have negotiated fleet contracts with men who tried to bury me in fine print. And I have never felt as managed as I felt at that table. Each small correction carried the same message underneath. You can visit, you cannot stay. And the cruelty of it was that none of it was loud enough to name. Death by 1,000 forks. I started rehearsing sentences in my truck on the drive over, trying to sound like a person they wouldn't need to correct. I, who once told a state contractor exactly where he could put his lowball bid, sat there practicing how to be smaller. I finally said something to Nathaniel on the drive home one night. Not an accusation, just a small, careful truth. Your mother doesn't like me. He sighed the tired sigh of a man who'd been managing this weather his whole life. She's like that with everyone. Give her time. Just don't give her anything to hold on to. I asked what that meant. Don't make waves. Let her run the wedding. It's easier. I wanted him to say she was wrong about me and that he'd make her stop. Instead, he asked me to be quieter. And the terrible part is I understood. He'd spent 34 years learning that surviving Catherine Pierce meant giving her no edges to grip. He wasn't betraying me. He was teaching me how he'd survived. But I didn't want to survive her. I wanted him to stand in front of me. Bianca invited me to coffee, just the two of us. To get to know each other. She arrived with a leather folder and a warm smile and spent 10 minutes being kinder than she'd ever been. Then the questions started, and they weren't the questions of a woman getting to know a sister. Where did I live? Did I own or rent? How many people worked for me, roughly? Was the work seasonal? She was mapping me. Running an arithmetic I recognized because I'd spent my whole life dodging the same one. Except hers was running backward from what I expected. She wasn't trying to find out how much I had. She was trying to confirm how little. I gave her small, true, incomplete answers, and I let her write the story she'd already decided on. I drove home certain that coffee hadn't been a welcome. It had been discovery. And discovery is what you do before a trial. Part 4. I heard the word for the first time through a door I wasn't supposed to be behind. Another dinner, another hallway I didn't know, looking for a bathroom. Catherine's voice came low and certain from the study, nothing like the voice she used in front of guests. We need to protect this family, she was saying. Bianca answered, something I couldn't catch. Then Catherine again, clear as a bell. She's after what's left. Plain and simple. A gold digger, Bianca, dressed up in a work jacket. I stood in that dark hallway with my hand on the wall and didn't move. Gold digger. The word sat in my chest like a swallowed stone. I'd spent my whole life so afraid of being wanted for my money that I'd hidden it from the world. And here was a woman deciding I was a thief for money I'd never touched and didn't need, but it was 3 other words that kept me frozen there. After what's left. You don't say, what's left about a full account? You say it about a draining one. About the bottom of something. I turned that phrase over and over. And for the first time since I'd met the Pierces, the ground shifted under the story I'd been told about them. A name on a cornerstone. A tired lake house. And somewhere in that study, the matriarch of it all was guarding what was left. I went back to the table, smiled, and started paying very quiet attention. I did not get angry. Anger is loud, and loud is what they wanted. Instead, the next morning, I did what any business owner with a functioning brain does after hearing the word thief attached to her name. I called my attorney. Not to attack anyone. To protect what I'd built. I told her I was engaged, and what I'd overheard. And she said the thing lawyers say that sounds cold until you need it. Dana, you run a company worth 8 figures and you have 0 legal protection. We fixed that before the wedding, not after. So we started. We kept my business assets clearly separate. We drafted a prenuptial agreement of my own, one that protected Whitfield Fleet Services. My properties, my accounts, everything I'd built with my grandfather's boots in the back of the truck. From anyone who might one day decide it was family property. I've watched too many people hand over everything they built just to keep the peace. And I decided I wasn't going to be one of them. I signed nothing that day. I just made sure that whatever the Pierces were planning, I wasn't walking into it with empty hands. I put the folder in a drawer and told myself I was being careful, not suspicious. I didn't yet know I'd need it. I didn't yet know they were about to hand me the exact reason. I found out what what's left meant on a Sunday. Looking for a powder room and opening the wrong door at the lake house. It was the study, Catherine's private room, and I stepped in before I realized where I was. The first thing I saw was the wall. A clean, bright rectangle in the middle of faded wallpaper, exactly the shape of a large painting that was no longer there. I know that shape. It's the ghost a picture leaves after hanging somewhere for decades and then, suddenly, not. Around the room there were more of them. Pale wounds where things used to be. A cabinet stood open and half empty. On the desk, not hidden, just sitting there the way things sit in a house where no guest ever wanders, was a short stack of mail. The top envelope had a bank's logo and a red stamp I could read from the doorway. Past due. Under it, the corner of a glossy sheet, the kind auction houses send for estate appraisals. I stood very still with my hand in my coat pocket and, without deciding to, closed my fingers around my grandfather's boot's old bootlace, which I still carry looped through a keyring. The whole story turned over in my hands like a coin. They hadn't looked down on me because I had nothing. They'd looked down on me because I had something real, growing, mine, and they were quietly, desperately running out. The portraits and the pearls and the name. On the cornerstone were a beautiful front on an emptying house. Catherine wasn't protecting a fortune from a fortune hunter. She was hiding the absence of one, and she needed a thief in the room so nobody looked too closely at the vault. I backed out of that study and pulled the door shut. And for the first time in 2 years, I wasn't afraid of them. After that door, every insult I'd swallowed changed flavor in my mouth. The correction of my forks, the survey over coffee, how sensible about my ring. None of it had ever been about protecting a legacy. There was no legacy left to protect. It was about controlling the story in the room. Keeping every eye on the poor, unsuitable woman Nathaniel had dragged home. So nobody counted the empty spaces on the walls. And the strangest thing happened as I understood it. I stopped hating Catherine and started, against my will, to see her. Later that same visit, I passed the study again. The door was cracked and she was in there alone, holding one of the empty frames, polishing the glass over nothing, her hands moving in small, careful circles. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know I saw. She would have died before letting me see. I understood, watching her, that 40 years ago she'd walked into this family the same way I had, from somewhere with less, and they'd measured her at the door too. And she'd spent 4 decades learning to be a wall so smooth nobody could ever grip her again. She wasn't the author of the cruelty. She was its longest-serving employee. I felt something I hadn't planned to feel. Not forgiveness. Just recognition. She had a name and no money. I had money and no name. And one of us still believed that made me the one who brought nothing. You'd think, knowing what I knew, that I'd have left right then. I didn't, because I still loved Nathaniel, the gentle man from the roadside who quoted books back at me in the rain. And because I still wanted the table, even a table in a frightened, emptying house. That's the part I'm least proud of and most honest about. Knowing they had nothing didn't cure me of wanting them. It just changed what I was afraid of. I decided not to use what I knew. I wouldn't walk into a dinner and announce I'd seen the past due notices, that I knew the vault was empty, that the whole performance was held together with pearls and nerve. That would have been cruelty answering cruelty, their game played back at them. And it would have won me nothing I actually wanted. So I kept the secret. Kept my folder in its drawer and kept showing up smaller each time. Hoping that if I was patient and good and quiet enough, the door would finally open on its own. I still thought I could earn my way in. I was about to find out the door had never been closed to keep me out. It had been closed so they could choose the exact moment to open it, and make sure everyone was watching when they did. The ultimatum arrived dressed as a formality. Nathaniel told me 3 weeks before the wedding, looking at his shoes. Mom thinks we should have a prenup. Just to make everyone comfortable. Bianca's lawyer is drawing something up. I asked to see it, and when it came, I read it twice to be sure I understood what I was holding. It wasn't a prenup in any fair sense. It was a surrender. In the event of divorce, I would leave with nothing. Worse, The document defined everything I brought into the marriage as family property, held in trust by the Pierces. My company. My properties. Everything I'd built with my own two hands before I'd ever heard the name Pierce. They wanted me to sign my life's work over to a family that was hiding past due notices in a study. And the beautiful, absurd logic of it was this: they still thought I was poor. They thought Whitfield Fleet Services was one battered truck and a seasonal side hustle. This whole crushing document was designed to protect their non-existent fortune from my non-existent one. It would have been funny if it weren't aimed at the one thing in the world that was truly mine. I sat with that document a long time. I didn't call my lawyer yet. I wanted to see how far they'd take it. I wanted to see if the man I loved would take it there with them. I put their prenup in the same drawer as mine, 2 folders side by side, and I waited for the Pierces to show me exactly who they were. I gave Nathaniel the chance to be the man I hoped he was. I laid their document flat on our kitchen table where he couldn't pretend not to see it, and I asked him one question. "Do you know what this actually says?" He read it. I watched his face, waiting for the anger, the flush, the moment he'd crumple it in his fist and say, "Absolutely not. You are not signing this." That's not what happened. He read it and he got quiet. Then he said the words that ended something between us I'm not sure ever fully came back. "Just sign it. It's only paper. You and I both know we'll never actually get divorced, so it doesn't matter what it says. Sign it, make her comfortable, and then we can just be happy." I looked at the man I loved across my own kitchen table and understood he was asking me to sign my grandfather's boots away too. Hand over everything I'd built on paper. So, woman who'd called me a thief could feel like she'd won. "It's only paper," he said, the way people say things when they've never had to build anything, and so cannot imagine losing it. It was not only paper to me. It was every 3 a.m. highway call. It was my grandfather's boots. And the man who was supposed to stand in front of me had just asked me to lie down. I told him I'd think about it. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did the thing I never let myself do. I looked straight at my own life. I saw a girl in a garage apartment learning that the way to keep people was to need them and never threaten them. I saw a young woman hiding her first real money like something shameful. I saw myself letting the flinch show, dressing down on purpose, telling everyone I loved a smaller version of myself so they wouldn't leave, and I saw where it had brought me, to a kitchen table at 32. Being asked to sign away the one thing I'd never made smaller. In order to keep a family that had never once chosen me. The armor hadn't protected me. The armor was the wound. My grandfather didn't raise me to be small. He raised me to build. He wore those boots like a crown, and somewhere along the way I'd taken everything he gave me and hidden it in a glove box. Ashamed, as if worth were something you needed to apologize for. I lay there in the dark, and for the first time in a very long time, I stopped apologizing. In the morning, I called my attorney, and this time it was different. Last time I'd been protecting myself out of fear. This time I was doing something quieter and harder to name. I asked her to prepare a full financial disclosure. Everything. The real numbers, the valuation, the properties, the accounts, all of it laid out plainly on paper. I asked her to finalize my own prenuptial agreement, the one that protected everything I'd built, and to add 1 page of plain legal fact at the front. She told me exactly what I needed to hear. A prenup pushed on someone under pressure, without their own attorney, without full and honest disclosure from both sides, isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It can be thrown out entirely. A fair agreement requires both people to show their real numbers, in the open, with time to think and counsel to advise. Their document did none of that. It was theater. Bad theater. At that dot I put my folder together. The disclosure, my own agreement, the page of law, and set it by the door. I didn't know yet if I'd open it. I only knew I wouldn't walk in without it. Bianca let it slip. The way people let things slip when they want you to know but can't admit it. We were confirming numbers for the engagement dinner. And she mentioned lightly that it would be a full room, 40 people. All the important ones. "Everyone will be there," she said, smiling, "to witness you joining the family." The smile had teeth. I went home and sat with that sentence. Witness you joining the family. 40 people, the important ones. And I understood exactly what that dinner was going to be. Not a dinner. A stage. They were going to hand me their document in front of 40 of the oldest names in the county. At the exact moment, refusing would look like the tantrum of an ungrateful fortune hunter. They'd chosen the audience on purpose. A woman alone at a kitchen table can say no easily. A woman surrounded by 40 watching faces, the night before her wedding, with the man she loves looking at her hopefully. That woman is supposed to be too ashamed to refuse. Public was their weapon. Shame was the pen they meant to put in my hand. And sitting there, I realized something that surprised me. Public could work the other way too. If they wanted 40 witnesses, they were going to get 40 witnesses. Just not to what they'd planned. I want to be clear, I didn't decide to humiliate them. I decided only that whatever happened in that room, it was going to happen in the light, and for the first time in my life, I was going to be exactly my full size. The night before the dinner, I sat alone at my kitchen table with two things in front of me, the bootlace from my grandfather's old boots, worn smooth from years on my keyring, and the folder by the door. I didn't rehearse a speech. For once in my life, I didn't practice being anyone. I just sat with the quiet and asked myself what I actually wanted underneath the wanting to belong. Underneath 2 years of shrinking. The answer, when it came, was simple. And it cost me something to say it, even to an empty room. I wanted to be able to look at myself. Not to win. Not to destroy them. Not even anymore to be let in. I wanted to walk out of tomorrow able to face the woman who'd built 32 trucks out of one. The woman my grandfather raised. Everything I'd done for 2 years had been a slow trade of that woman for a chair. And I was done trading. I held that bootlace and made myself a promise in his voice. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would not walk into that room as anyone smaller than I actually was. I didn't know yet if I'd marry Nathaniel. That's the honest truth. I loved him, and I didn't know if a man who could ask me to sign away my life's work to soothe his mother could ever learn to stand in front of me instead of beside me while I bled. But I knew one thing with total clarity. Sitting there in the dark, I was done auditioning. The part had never been mine to earn. The inn's private dining room was beautiful in the way a stage set is beautiful, if you know where to look. I looked. The flower arrangements were silk, not fresh, dressed up under warm lighting so most people wouldn't notice. The staff was half what a room that size should have had. The lighting had been dimmed to a flattering gold that also conveniently hid the worn carpet near the fireplace. 40 of the oldest names in the county sat at round tables in their good jewelry, believing they were dining inside old money's house. I knew better now. I knew the whole room was held up with nerve and silk flowers and a name on a cornerstone. Catherine worked the room like the performance of her life. Radiant, gracious, touching elbows, calling people darling. Bianca orbited her. At the far end of the head table sat Richard Pierce, Nathaniel's father, a quiet man I'd barely heard speak in 2 years. He was watching me, not with the polite arithmetic everyone else used. He was watching me the way you watch weather you're not sure about. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. And something in his face was almost an apology he didn't have the courage to say out loud. I took my seat. My clutch sat in my lap, and inside my coat, folded flat, was my folder. Their document was already on the table, tucked under Catherine's place setting, where she thought I couldn't see it, waiting for its moment. 40 people lifted their glasses, and I understood the dinner had already begun, and that everyone in that room was about to get exactly what they came for. Just not the way they expected. It happened between the appetizer and the toast. Catherine stood, tapped her glass with a spoon, and the room went soft and attentive the way rooms do for a woman like her. She thanked everyone for coming. She said a few gracious words about family, about legacy, about protecting what generations had built. Then, still smiling, still radiant, she reached under her place setting, drew out the document, and slid it across the linen tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of me. "There's just one small family matter to attend to first," she said, her voice carrying to the back tables the way she'd trained it to for 40 years. "Dana, dear, before you join this family, we need you to sign this." She let a pause open. And into that pause, so not one of the 40 could miss it. She said the thing she'd been wanting to say to me for 2 years. Sign it, gold digger. You bring nothing to this family. The room didn't gasp. It did something worse. It went still. 40 of the oldest names in the county sat with their forks halfway up. And I could feel the verdict already forming on their faces, the old, easy verdict about the woman with the tow truck who'd reached too high. Nathaniel had gone white beside me. Bianca watched with the small, hungry stillness of someone who'd waited a long time for a show. And Catherine stood over me, gracious and merciless, holding out a pen. I looked at the document on the tablecloth. Then I looked up at her, and I did the one thing she wasn't prepared for. I smiled and I picked up the pen. I did not sign. I read calmly into the silence of that room. I began reading their document out loud to the 40 witnesses they'd so thoughtfully assembled. In the event of dissolution of the marriage, I read, the party of the second part shall relinquish all claim to assets, and shall convey any and all property, business interests, and holdings brought into the marriage to the Pierce Family Trust. I paused and looked up. That's me, I said. The party of the second part. Everything I bring, signed over to your family forever. Is that right, Catherine? Her smile flickered, just slightly, because this wasn't the script. In her script, I was supposed to be crying by now, or fleeing, or scrawling my name in shame. Instead, I was reading her own weapon back to her slowly, so everyone could hear exactly what the gracious Pierces were asking of the woman they'd called nothing. I kept the pen in my hand. Let them all watch me hold it over the signature line, and felt the whole room lean in. 40 people, certain they were about to watch a fortune hunter sign her own surrender. Nathaniel whispered my name, half a plea, half a warning. Catherine's chin lifted in something like triumph. And Richard, at the end of the table, set his glass down very carefully, as if he'd already seen something the rest of them hadn't. I let the moment stretch until it was almost unbearable. The pen poised, the room holding its breath. It's a generous document, I said quietly. It really does account for everything I'm bringing to this family. Then I set the pen down on the tablecloth, next to their document. And I did not sign it. Into that confused, breathing silence. I reached into my coat and took out a plain manila folder and laid it on the table in front of me. There's just one thing it's missing, I said. I opened it without hurry because there was no longer any reason to rush. It's missing the other party's disclosure. A fair agreement shows both people's numbers. So let me show you mine. I began to read. Still calm, still quiet. And the numbers filled that room like water filling a low place. Whitfield Fleet Services, I read. Commercial towing and recovery. 32 vehicles, 70 employees, contracts across 3 counties and 2 hospital systems. I read the valuation of my company, and somewhere behind me a fork touched a plate and stopped. I read the properties I owned outright. I read the investment accounts. I laid each page down as I went, face up, a plain paper trail of a life built by hand. With every page, the arithmetic in that room ran backward, then broke. These were not the numbers of a fortune hunter with a beat-up truck. They were the numbers of a woman who could have bought the inn, the lake house, and the name on the cornerstone, and had money left over. You said I bring nothing to this family, I said, and looked up at Catherine, whose face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Let's read what nothing looks like. At the end of the head table, Richard Pierce, the quiet man who was the only person in that room who actually knew what the family accounts held, put both hands flat on the table and half rose out of his chair, staring at my pages because he understood before anyone else what those numbers meant. He understood which family in this marriage had actually been marrying up. He caught himself, sat back down slowly, and did not take his eyes off me. Here's where they thought it ended. They thought I'd slide my own document across the table now, the way they'd slid theirs, and crush them with it in front of 40 witnesses. Take the empty rectangles on Catherine's wall and the past due notices, and hold them up to the light. It would have been easy. It would have made me exactly what they'd called me. Someone who came to that table to take dot, so I didn't do it. I took out the last page of my folder. My own prenuptial agreement. The one that protected everything I'd built, and I didn't read it to the room. I simply laid it down and said quietly, "I brought a document too. Mine protects what I made, from anyone who ever decides it's theirs." I was going to sign it and marry into this family anyway, because I wanted to belong here more than I wanted to be safe. Then I stood up. I stood up in front of 40 of the oldest names in the county, at my own engagement dinner, and I set the pen down for good. "I'm not going to sign yours," I said to Catherine. "And I'm not going to marry your family." I never was. I turned to Nathaniel and said the truest thing I'd ever said out loud. "I'll marry you at the courthouse Tuesday with nothing changing hands but a promise and no one's name on it but ours. Or I'll wish you a good life and go build mine. But I am done earning a seat at a table that put a price on me. Choose now, Nathaniel." "Not for her. For you." The room was utterly silent. I had just given up the wedding I'd dreamed of, the family I'd shrunk myself for 2 years to join, and quite possibly the man I loved, all in one breath, standing up. And I want you to understand something. For the first time in my entire life, standing there having lost all of it, I felt exactly my full-size. Nathaniel stood up. For a long moment he looked at his mother, then at me, and I watched 34 years of learning to be smooth war with something braver underneath. Then he did a thing I'd never once seen him do. He walked around the table, past his mother's outstretched hand, and came and stood beside me, taking my hand in front of everyone. He turned to Catherine and said, in a voice that shook and held anyway, "You just showed me exactly who values what in this family." Catherine, who had run that room like a stage her whole life, finally lost the performance. Her composure cracked, and the truth hissed out of her, meant only for me but loud enough for the front tables to hear. "You have no idea what it costs to keep this family's name." For just a second, I did feel it. The 40 years, the empty frames, the shaking hands. A woman who'd been measured at a door once too, and had never stopped bleeding from it. I didn't hate her. But I didn't sit back down either. Richard caught my eye from the end of the table and gave me the smallest nod, a quiet man's apology and blessing at once. I picked up my folder and my keys, the bootlace still looped through them. And I walked out of that beautiful, dimly lit, silk-flowered room with my hand in Nathaniel's. My full size. At last. We married the following Tuesday morning at the county courthouse. I wore a simple dress. Nathaniel wore his good coat, the one with the mended pocket. 2 of my crew stood as witnesses, the men and women who'd built my life alongside me, the ones Catherine would have seen about space for. There were no silk flowers, no 40 faces doing arithmetic. Just a clerk, a promise, and nothing changing hands but that. Richard came. He stood at the back of that small room alone, the way he'd watched me across the head table, and afterward he took my hand in both of his rough, older ones and held it a moment. "We were the ones marrying up," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it out loud. Catherine didn't come. I didn't expect her to. And I found standing in that plain bright room that I didn't need her to. The table I'd spent 2 years trying to earn my way into had turned out to be a stage in an emptying house, and I had finally walked off it into a marriage that had my full size in it and room to spare. It was the smallest wedding in the history of the Pierce name. It was the first honest one. The lake house sold that autumn. The Pierce name stayed carved into the mill cornerstone, the way it always had, but the county learned soon enough what had been hiding behind it, the way small counties always do. I didn't lift a finger to save the Pierces, and I didn't lift a finger to sink them either. I let them keep their name and their debt and their empty frames, and I stayed out of it, because their story was no longer mine to write. Whitfield Fleet Services took on 2 more counties that year. Nathaniel kept teaching and slowly learned how to stand in front of me instead of beside me while I bled. We bought a house with money I'd made with my own hands, and we put both our names on the deed, separate and clear and honest. Everything in the open, the way a fair agreement is actually supposed to work. He never once asked me to be smaller again. And I never once, in that house, had to pretend I was less than exactly what my grandfather raised me to be. I hung his old work boots on the wall of my new office, framed in the spot where the morning light hits first. Not hidden in a truck bed anymore. Not shameful, not small, right out in the open, where anyone who comes to talk business can see them. Worn and cracked and worth more to me than every painting that ever hung in Catherine Pierce's study. Sometimes, early before the crews roll out, I stand and look at them and think about the empty rectangle on her wall, the ghost of a thing she sold to keep a name. And I think about what I hung up in its place. She spent her life defending a wall with nothing behind it. I spent mine ashamed of everything I'd actually built. In the end, only one of us learned to put her worth where the light could reach it. Here's the only lesson I took from all of it, and I give it to you plainly. Worth isn't something you inherit at a table someone else sets. It's something you build with your own two hands, and no one, no matter whose name is carved into stone, gets to slide it back across a tablecloth and call it nothing. That's my story. A folder I almost never opened. A pen I picked up, then put down. And a name I finally stopped trying to earn. If anyone ever made you feel like you brought nothing to the table, go count what you built with your own two hands, and count it out loud. Do it today. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.